Yeah?
Yes.
Falling out of my pocket.
Reminds me, it's gonna be
Pretty low risk for that. I love the sound, by the way.
We are going to get started. Thank you all for being here. We are Head High. Some of you know us, some of you don't, but we are an organization dedicated to art, design, and architecture publications and cultural programming. I'm Alexandra Hodkowski. I'm one of the co-founders here with Alvaro Alcocer. We are so excited for today. As you know, we do a lot of cultural programming. We do different setups. We do sound stuff. We do a lot of architecture book talks, but we've never had this set up, so welcome to this experimental formation. The format for the night is going to start with a bit of a presentation and then jump into a conversation, and there's also amazing music involved that is customized for the space that you'll hear more about, but I'm not going to say anything more because Jonas, our guest, will talk a little bit more about the other panelists. If you want to call it that. The book that we're celebrating has just come out, literally. It just arrived today. And congrats, Jonas, it's amazing. Material and yes. And yeah, we're thinking about AI as material tonight. And in the book, it's incredible. There's so many contributions. There's incredible images. And we can't wait to hear more. Jonas, I'll just give you a very brief introduction. Many of you seem to know Jonas already, but he is a German architect and American professor based in Brooklyn. He explores the intersection of technology and material philosophy in design, and his research and teaching at Pratt Institute and the University of Pennsylvania focus on social and ecological equity in urban housing and urban design. The book is here, and we can tell you more about how to get it after we hear more about the book itself. And I'm going to hand it over to Jonas now, if he's ready. Oh, shoot. Okay.
Thank you so much, Alexandra.
Okay.
Does it work?
Yep.
Can you see? Can you hear? Okay, good. Thank you so much, Alexandra and Alvaro. I feel myself a little head high right now. Because I don't think I've ever been in a room with so many friendly faces in my life. It's quite amazing. I don't know how to express that feeling. Anyhow, let's get started. And I want to start by thanking the hosts, Alexandra and Alvaro, and also congratulate them. Just last week, the AIA New York announced its 2026 honors and awards recipients, and won a Head High with the Architecture and Media Award. A major achievement, I think. Yeah, to sustain a cultural project of this significance in a city and country so often driven by economic priorities. As few things are less lucrative or more necessary than the intersection of architecture and books. Right? Thank you. And congratulations. There's another wonderful picture of these two. I actually like this. This is one of the most elegant things I've seen on Instagram last week. It's like Audrey Hepburn, perhaps, moving into Tiffany's, but it's the ballroom. Okay, so I want to also thank our dean, Killian Riano, that is the School of Architecture, of course, at Pratt Institute, as well as Stephen Slaughter, and I want to give a particular shout out to this man because he's the chair of the undergraduate department of architecture. And he just said, you know what, we're just going to do it for real. We're going to do it at Head High. And so he came up with that idea, so I want to thank Stephen Slaughter for doing it. So this photo, you might wonder why we have two professional bio photos on each side, and then Stephen got this blurry little cropped out photo, and that is because I took this before another recent event at Pratt that, again, Killian and Stephen were largely responsible for, and together with our colleague Jason Vinier-Bean, it was called the Transductions AI panel at Pratt, and it was, I think, a very important event, and it was important to me also on a personal level. I get to that in a second. But this is the full picture, and just so you know, this sign was not drawn by Stephen at all. In fact, this was hung at his office as a protest against anything AI. And I want to make something very clear, because there are some misunderstandings. The concerns are real. The concerns around AI are real, and also amongst the student body. And these signs that we see here, posted around the architecture school, Higgins Hall, speak directly to that. And I want to take a moment to say how crucial critical voices are here in this discussion, and they belong at the center of this discussion. All of us here, and I'm speaking to the panel that I will introduce in a moment, in this circle hear and share these concerns deeply. And now, why it was personally a really important event for me was because it gave me the opportunity to reconnect with an old friend at Keller. He sits right here. And let me just say, a few days ago, Ed offered a crazy, well, let me put it this way. Gökhan said in a text, hey, we should have Ed play some music. And I say, that's a brilliant idea. Let's do it. I hope he says yes. And then, not only did he say yes, but he fully embraced the idea. And he said, you know what, Jonas? I'm going to create a sonic landscape interpretation of your book. And that's the moment when I was first head high this week. I could not believe my luck and all our luck that Ed Keller would offer just this. And we see him here on the right side. This is me being just over with joy because I haven't seen this man for years. And at the bottom left, you see him on the far right side and me on the far left side, and you see me lean in, trying to be closer, maybe trying to channel some connection there over 10 feet or so, and I think it worked. So this is the bio of Ed Keller, which I cannot read right now. I'm also a little bit too nervous to get it right. So I'm just going to tell you something that's really important for all of us and for me personally, because I've experienced it in part. Ed has been a pioneer of computational design since the early 1990s. For many of our students here, that's before you were born. I remember very clearly the moment when Columbia's Avery Hall became one of the first places where design computation was approached as a creative discipline rather than a purely technical one. At the time I was at MIT, where computation often still felt technocratic, and I kept looking towards Columbia thinking, that is where something important is happening. And Ed was central to that shift. I had the great fortune a couple of years later to become a student of his, and sometime later a friend. Thank you, Ed, for everything you've done for this evening and for being here. And I want to refer back to MIT at the time. because another very dear professor of mine is here, Joan Loke. Joan Loke was a video professor at MIT in the mid-90s when Lily Zan, sitting here to my left, had the great fortune, as I did, to be her student. And that friendship and that creative intellectual exchange has endured. Recently we spoke about Minsky, one of the so-called fathers of AI. And she said to me, that's all good what you're saying there, but you need to make it more accessible. You gotta write like Minsky. So I read Minsky and I was like, no way. And so there is a paragraph in this book that is a critique of Minsky's. But without Joan, it probably wouldn't be in there. Let's enjoy this piece. Here comes the flood for a moment. It's adds, can I say AI work? And you hear in the background something very subtle surfing that wave. Oops, wrong way. It's missing something. Oh, here we go. Danielle Willems, we've been colleagues and friends for so many years at Pratt Institute and at University of Pennsylvania. And besides the, I want to say, deeper commonalities we have when it comes to AI and the conceptual approach to AI, something else in flesh and body connects us, even though he's here, unfortunately, only remotely. If you can pull up your phone a little bit and show Ezio around. This is Ezio Blasetti, and I get to talk more about him in a second. So Danielle, this is on the right side is a AI summit. And Danielle invited me to join that summit, and I'm very grateful. And next to me on the other side is Drew Busmeyer, who is right here. And I want to focus on Danielle's work, but I don't have an image right now. We kind of wanted to hand that over just before the event, and I came late. So. But both, so Ezio was a computational consultant to my studios of experiment at Pratt for a number of years, and Drew was in that officially same capacity, and all the magic you see in that book of those years at that school, in that studio, would not have been possible without these guys. Now to Danielle's work, we have seen the, let's say, the symbiosis of architecture and fashion at the very latest since the Bauhaus. And I say this not lightly, but the only time I've ever seen that be meaningful to me was in Danielle Willems' work. The work she does at University of Pennsylvania with her student and in her own right, and also with Ezio. But really the work, the project that she invented and shepherded and brought to the level that it is now, is bringing originally digital computational design and fashion together, and now, more recently, primarily through video-to-video AI and fashion, and the pieces that come out of this. They're not only gorgeous, but they're also actually physical, material, and they're worn, and they're shown at fashion shows. Thank you so much, Danielle, for joining us today. this is her bio, and again here I'm not going to read this, but if you look at the invitation, the bio should be in that email or in the link, the page that's linked from that email. I honestly don't have the words to describe the impact that Gökhan Kodalak had on this book and on me and the planet. His thinking has been profoundly important to me and to the book, which is not the same thing. And I leave it there and just read my thanks to him from the acknowledgements in the book. Oh, now I got it. I put that on the slide itself. Okay. No, I didn't. Where is it? Here we go. Gökhan Kodalak is a theorist teaching philosophy of architecture and nature at Pratt Institute. No, that's his bio. You can read that. I have an acknowledgement. Here we go. Sorry about that. So this is from the acknowledgements, which I will read from a little bit more, or at least show you them. I think we could spend the entire night just because all of the people here in some way or another have contributed to this book. The book really embodies the idea of it too, that there is no single designer, author, or anything. I mean, literally, you can flip to the pages. There's not one spread that is solely authored by me. Every other page is an image of a gorgeous work by a student, to say the very least. And every philosophical thought has been run down and either originally stimulated by or at least approved by Gökhan. Though he resisted to read the book until now, it was hard for me because I really wanted him to be part of the book. If I can use that word, nearly begged him to contribute a piece, and he just resisted all the time. I was desperate. I said, Gökhan, you have to be in this book, and he is in this book, plenty. But I meant like with an actual piece. He was so generous years earlier to actually write a piece for my studio. It's called Cities Alive, or The City Alive, which was for our urban housing studio. And in my imagination, he would muster the second one of these, specifically for the book. But generous and thinking with an extended mind, he said, no, my friend, this is your first book, and it should be just, one text, and not a collection. And I said, it's not a collection if you write perhaps an intro, or an extra, or whatever, right? But he said, no way, brother, you gotta do this by yourself, okay? And I didn't, of course. And he helped me through I should quote Gökhan by saying, in his very dry and no BS demeanor, when I was kind of freaking out in the middle of writing the manuscript, he said, yeah, writing a book is a religious experience. Okay, so now finally I get to the acknowledgements in the book. My friend and collaborator, the philosopher and architect Gökhan Kodalak, has enriched and expanded the conceptual grounds of his work. His intellectual rigor, openness, and preeminent expertise in Spinoza in architecture have distinguished his enduring roles as a true critic in my design studios and co-conspirator in our design philosophy course, What is Design? A really important project, I think, not only for Gökhan and me, but for the students, and I want to say also for the School of Architecture at Pratt. I hope it can be continued in some form or fashion one day. And now I would like to continue with the excerpts of the acknowledgements. I can't really see the text from here, so I have to rely on the notes that I have. And they're all lost. No, here, I'm sorry, here, this is the text, okay. Let me read only what's white, You see there's some gray words and there's some white words. So the sense of collaboration extends beyond the contents of the book and its making. Writing a book, I said that earlier, is much like design, not a solitary act. This work has been formed by abundant, generous exchanges. Generous is the key word here. With friends, colleagues, experts, and non-human partners of various kinds. First, I thank my students at Pratt Institute and the University of Pennsylvania. Their enthusiasm, curiosity, and dedication have been a constant source of inspiration. I read a little bit of the gray, if I may. Nearly all the visuals in this volume showcase design material produced by them, stemming from graduate level architecture and urban design studios and seminars they took with me over the past few years. Guiding and witnessing these talented young minds grow into autonomous and confident designers has been among the greatest joys of my academic life. This book is a tribute to my students, their work, and at its heart, the studio culture we have built together. I have learned more from them than they realize. Gisela will join us later. She's right now at Bard at our son's thesis project. I was there earlier today, and it was really beautiful. I'm showing you guys on my phone a couple of pictures later. She will come later. The contribution was more spiritual and emotional. There's no direct, tangible relationship to the book, but that's not lesser in any way whatsoever, as you can imagine, doing a religious experience like that. David Barraby on the other side, science writer and good friend, and in this context, my editor. Not the official editor by Wiley's, but the editor that I was so fortunate to have with me in the formative months of this project, very early on. I want to just give you a glimpse on this. And there was one moment I remember precisely when we both were aware that the book was to have 70,000 words. And I had, where's David? Oh, there you are. Thank you. I had, I don't want to exaggerate, but let's just say like at least 250 to 300,000 words. And I said to him, I don't know, I can't cut, I can't cut 80% of this. It's just no friggin' way. And I tasked him with something that must be an impossible challenge for an editor, I imagine. And I gave him a color code. I don't remember, let's just say yellow, green, and red, right? Was it like that? And I said, so red, the stuff that you think absolutely must go. And then green as a fallback, and yellow we can discuss. And make it so that we get to 100,000 words. So you can imagine how significant that impact is for a book. I did also tell him I'm not going to take the decision on face value, I'm going to go through the decisions, right? But they were hugely informative on what material actually made it into the book, what became the 70,000 words. This is one enormous impact. Another one is, there are two people in this room who've been hugely important for this book, who also basically disagree with me on a fundamental level. And David is one of them. David's concern, if I may paraphrase, was that in my attempt, and I kind of want to say Gökhan in my attempt, but let's just say the author, the book's attempt to decenter humanity could be misread as anti-human. And I assured him, David, I'm not anti-human. I think humans are pretty bad though. And he made sure that a paragraph, I think there's a paragraph that was almost, I want to say, written by him, and he made sure that one is in there, which I wrote but wasn't sure I put in there, which distinguishes between, and these are very academic terms, which is weird because his actual official job was to make sure it's readable for a non-academic audience and to make sure there's no jargon in there, right? But so I'm going to use a little jargon here. So anthropocentric and human conducive design. So the fine distinction between decentering humanity, if you will, and being against humans. I am not. I think we're all not. I hope not. But that doesn't mean that we put ourselves above other things, I think, anyway. So thank you, David. Maybe we should also give a hand for everybody. So Gökhan and I already talked about, and it's you too. So it's you, this is your part in the acknowledgements, and there's pages that are also more or less written by Ezio that are the technical pages that were, they don't look like anymore, but they were so heavily informed by his input that the studios would not have existed in the form that they did if Ezio hadn't shepherded them. And that's true with Andrew as well in the years when New York Institute of Technology snatched Ezio away from us and opened the space for his dear friend Andrew. So thank you, both of you guys. Rakesh Dedi Kumar is not here, but it's an interesting short anecdote. I was at a Shivananda ashram, and you know, my greatest dream was to perhaps one day show my manuscript to Sanford Kwinter, and I know I couldn't do this by regular means, so I figure I have to somehow find something attractive, and I thought a printed manuscript, maybe even with yellow highlighters, could attract him in this digital age. So I printed out the manuscript. It was pretty formed at the time already. And I continue this part later, but concluding with Rakesh or Teddy, I was sitting at this table at the ashram in the Catskills, and there was an Indian gentleman senior to me on the same table, and I had this manuscript, this printed with yellow marker, you know, prototype on the table, and he was, you know, a much more yogic person than me. I kept chatting at these lunches, and he would just be still and enjoy the moment. But he did glance at the book, and he saw something about artificial on the cover. Back then, I had it on the covers. No, that's not true. It was like now, it was just, I put the cover down on the table. So he saw that, and he said, you know, I'm a computer scientist, and I'm specialized in artificial intelligence, specifically, you know, visual media, spatial media. And who would have thought that? And he was so generous and invited me to his little room, and we had a long, long conversation about agentic AI, which is something that is I did not know about before. This is like a year and a half ago, or a year ago, something like that. But I did have something that sounded similar in my book, agentive material AI, and I tried to explain to him what that is, and he said, yeah, that's all good, but he was explaining to me that what agentic AI is, and we had a very, very fruitful conversation There's a chapter, a section in the book that explains the differences from the book's perspective. And you know what agentic AI is. So basically, a kind of an artificial architect in the sense of the multi-managing conductor bringing various AI models together to perform towards this particular goal, which is not the model of agentive material AI that I was writing about, which actually was more interested in the actual agency. And that is the part that is so scary for many people, and we'll get to that later. David Solomon unfortunately cannot be here either, but his contribution was very light. I said to Gisela, this was early on, no, not early on, but the manuscript was basically done, but nobody has read it. Nobody at all, not even Gisela. I think Ezio had an excerpt of a technical part, but didn't get to read the whole book or something like that. Remember Ezio? This is like maybe a year ago or something like that. And so I said that somebody needs to read this, and it would be great if it was somebody from within architecture who would tell me that I'm full of shit, or that I should go on with this. And so David Solomon read the whole thing and just, gave me some very precise feedback, right? And it was just so affirmative to me that somebody from my own discipline, somebody that I respect, was a colleague. We are not particularly close, we don't share reviews that often, but I knew about him. He's hanging out at Penn and Cornell at similar times. I know that he was a historian and an architect, and I always thought this man has a substance, and if he says it's not all crap, then maybe I can, I have something here. And Rachel Gould was the research assistant who made much of the book possible, because when I first submitted, so
Jonas?
Yeah.
Jonas, I'm here. Look, this is the most emotionally charged book launch that I've ever been. But as your no bullshit friend, can I ask you to move forward a bit faster? Yeah. Instead of thanking everyone.
All right, sorry about that. Okay, I'm sorry. I have to say, I'm slow because I didn't sleep much. But okay, thank you, Gökhan. As always, Gökhan brings me down to earth. So, Rachel, thank you for helping with the book proposal and organizing pages of student work. Adam Elstein did really great photography years before that, actually. And then again, when we were dealing with Wiley, you will see the images, they speak for themselves. I don't have to say much about it. Many know about his brilliant photography because it was generously taking photos of people and projects and objects at Pratt and around. So, and next to that, he also happens to be a professor and architect. Mia Landsbergis can also not be here. She was really important in the early years of developing certain kind of material. Let's say technique for our material urbanism program. She's now a professor in Kentucky. Let me just go a little bit faster, I guess. Yeah, okay, sorry. Marge, thank you so much for your contributions. I don't know if you're here. Brooke Borton, thank you so much for yours as a co-teacher. Wonderful former students who became TAs and co-teachers who were instrumental for much of the book. Rod and Greg, thank you so much for the continuous work you do at the robotic labs. Thank you, Jesse and Nanako. You guys have been good friends for a long time. Karen Barat, you gave me tips, so I have to hold on for 1 second here. And you can read what it says there. But I want to, on a personal note, that doesn't appear there. So he too resisted to actually engage with the text, other than actually the introduction, the preface, and the acknowledgements. His material contributions were, believe it or not, on the page layout and ideas like that. Not the actual layout, but the conceptual underpinnings for the way that I would approach it. And he thinks he took me out of modernist mind, German mind, into contemporary design, which is the only thing where I disagree with him on matters related to typographics, page layout, the design of the book. On the fundamental topics of the book, we completely disagree. And that's the remarkable thing. The remarkable thing is that Sanford Kwinter has been one of the most consequential supporters of this book. As a committed skeptic of its main argument, to me, that is the mark of a true scholar. Thank you so much, Sanford. Among other things, he introduced me to Luc Baumann, one of the best graphic designers on the planet that I would have never ever had met or convinced to look over my attempt to design a book and fine-tune it. Okay, so let's, thank the non-human participants as well and move on to what we wanted to do. Do we have the time still to go with our idea of having like 3 texts spoken and then discussed?
7:28.
Okay. All right. Can I read the first one though? Okay. Conversations about AI unfold at a moment of material and ecological destabilization. Though often framed as immaterial or abstract, AI is in itself materially entangled in these systems and in their destabilization. This work advances the material argument about AI, not as an abstract intelligence, but a material intelligence. Cognition, including the artificial kind, does not float above matter. It is inseparable from material processes. The machine is responding. The argument is developed through 3 domains of architecture: theory, technology, and design, and in that order. First, theory. These are, of course, just pills, snippets, but I think I want to lay out these 3 domains. Much of modern thought operates through dualities: mind and matter, nature and culture, human and machine, or what Donna Haraway calls the maze of dualisms through which we explain the world and our bodies to ourselves. The ecological crisis emerged from us imagining ourselves as outside of the systems we inhabit, or that what we call nature. If we now position AI as a tool, threat, captor, or savior, we risk reproducing that same structure. The material perspective refuses the idea that intelligence floats above matter. It treats cognition as emerging through entanglement distributed across bodies, environments, and infrastructures and technical objects. Second, technology. Classical computation was symbolic and binary. It modeled itself on language. It rendered reality into binary structures and deterministic trees. Much of late 20th century's thinking reinforced this through the hardware-software split. The idea that intelligence is abstractable from a substrate, that separation cannot be sustained. Intelligence is always already embodied. And contemporary AI systems operate differently. They are probabilistic in nature, navigate latent spaces, and require sources of randomness. In most current systems, including diffusion models, the noise driving these processes is generated algorithmically through pseudo-randomness. Yet genuine randomness ultimately derives from physical processes. And emerging AI developments increasingly turn to material itself as a source of entropy. In quantum computation, the bit is no longer simply on or off, the qubit fluctuates. At the computational base, abstraction and substrate are no longer cleanly separable. The production of intelligence here becomes inseparable from the dynamism of material itself. Third, design. Architecture is constituted through the convergence of theory, technology, and design. These domains are often separated and treated in isolation. In our studios, we work towards re-entangling them. Design unfolds as a material discursive practice. This is a term that I borrowed from Karen Barad and is discussed plenty in the second chapter of the book. When matter and meaning, thinking and making are inseparable. With this, AI systems, robotic fabrication, and physical material experiments are entangled in feedback loops. Material responses inform computation, computation informs fabrication, fabrication re-enters material. The idea of embodied intelligence, however, is not new. Alan Turing already imagined a machine that learns like a child through sensory engagement and launched one branch in this direction, which we associate with robotics and sensory karate and stuff like that. What interests me is not the fantasy of an autonomous abstract mind, but the possibility of machinic material intelligence. Systems that designers collaborate with and are shaped by as much as they shape them. And to put this briefly, in a climate oscillating between existential fear and naive optimism, we need another plane of engagement, not outside, not above, but within. And with this, we should have a conversation. Thank you.
Hello. In today's setup, I assume the role of an egghead theorist, which means you can exemplify by my pen and notes and book on the table. It means I'm going to contextualize some of the things that Jonas said and bring about philosophical implications. One of the dualities that Jonas just introduced is the mind-matter duality. And I think it's very important for the book because it's even in the title, Material and Artificial Intelligence. The problem, of course, goes back to, as usual, to the French philosopher, 17th century, we're talking about René Descartes, with the iconic dictum, as we all know, cogito ergo sum, which means, I think, therefore I am. Now, there are two things going on in that sentence. The first is that it introduces a bifurcation, a separation, right? Thinking and being are immediately divided into two realms. The more sinister approach in Descartes' dictum is that there's also a concealed hierarchy. So, what is called in philosophy a hierarchy of dependence, which means for me to exist even, right, I first need to have an access into it through my thinking. I think, therefore I am. My existence comes afterwards. So, those of you who know me knows that I am obsessed with another philosopher called Baruch Spinoza, who is also a 17th century philosopher, the very first one who goes against this with an incredible rigor. His position is a bit different. There is neither duality between mind and body, nor there is any kind of hierarchy. Mind and body are actually two different expressions of the same underlying continuum. So this means we can no longer talk about their distinction. We need to think about them always flowing together. So the Cartesian position is usually known as mind-body dualism. The Spinoza's position is usually known as mind-body parallelism. Now what Spinoza introduced in addition to this is also something we can call the immanence of mind and body to anything and everything in the cosmos, which is a more difficult pill to swallow, which means it's not just humans or animals that cogitate, that are bearers of information, but it is also rivers and rocks. And, you can also think about technical and architectural modalities. So more so a, let's say, distributed intelligence or cognition rather than an anthropocentric one. This has some consequences, especially for architecture. If you think about architecture, then it is no longer just material formation that we talk about when we talk about architecture, but is also architecture modalities are engines of information, which is important to think about. So in that sense, I think the book, one of the key questions that the book gives us is if intelligence is already flesh and earth, then is it not also silicon?
We can both use those microphones, right?
Yeah, you just gotta talk
I guess I want to pick up on a question of entropy, and I don't know if I'm going to link this back to Spinoza, Gökhan, but maybe I will. I wonder if the problem is a problem of de-centering the human or de-anthropocentrizing, or if we can literally stop talking about the human and simply say that we're interested in sentience and sapience as they emerge from low entropy systems or as low entropy systems. As a side note, Peter Watts, the science fiction writer, who some of you have probably read his novel Blindsight or Echopraxia or his Rifters trilogy. Peter, before he became a science fiction writer, was a marine biologist and wrote his PhD thesis on body temperature management in harbor seals, which is more complex than it sounds because they lay in the sun, but they also have a very thick insulating layer in their fur and their fat or their skin. And Peter makes a connection between the problem of heat management and the emergence of sentience and sapience. He actually imagines in one of his novels an alien species which has no capacity whatsoever for sapience, for self-recognition, but it does have star-faring capability. It does have terraforming capability. But the aliens absolutely cannot manage an image of themselves. They do not model themselves. They only exist in a state of what Stephen Shabiro has called discognition. Yeah? And I think that there's a thread to be tied here between basic questions of heat management. I feel like Fernandez Galeano talked about this in Fire and Memory also, about architecture as a heat management system, and tried to link it back through people like Perugin and Stengers. To make a connection between heat management, energy management, and architecture. And the question of a return to entropy here, for me, links inexorably to a question of temporality. The LLMs are, as they exist right now, prediction models. They're based on knowing what should come next, predicting what should come next, dropping that in, and building a kind of a linear temporality. Diffusion models are not quite so linear. Diffusion models applied to text are even more interesting because it seems to me they start moving in the direction, maybe a Spinoza's direction, of the formation of mind, which is capable of self-recognition. Now, I haven't talked about architecture yet here, and design, but maybe the phrase design as an act of futuring, which, if I remember correctly, comes from Tony Fry, is a way of thinking about energy management and the instantiation of mind and the imputation of a kind of temporality, or maybe several different models of temporality, which then opens the question, where does architecture sit in this in terms of defining a temporality? If you go back through Fernandez Galeano, it has something to do with heat management and the emergence of properties on top of properties and systems. So you have architecture, then you have a building code floating like an evanescent system on top of that. You have an intelligence of culture in the city floating on top of that, and so forth. And I'm remembering actually Sanford talking some years ago about the human body as a heat management system and the brain, emerging somehow next to or above that. I mean, literally above it, standing, 4, 5, 6 feet above the ground, and avoiding the radiant heat on the ground level, exactly. But I'm also interested in this question of futuring and where we can link energy management to futuring. And this is where I think that it's crucial to imagine, again, to use the term that Stephen Shaviro used, the different sort of spectra of discognition. Shaviro assumes that we're much less sapient than we usually assume we are. We're much more sentient and perhaps even subsentient as humans. But he also is almost a panpsychist in assuming, again, that things, matter, thinks. It just doesn't think the way that we think. And for me, this all ties back to a question of agency and where we position ourselves in matter and where we position ourselves in time. And I'm a broken record on this front. I always return to beautiful models that I find in the films of Wong Kar-wai, yeah, in Fallen Angels or Chungking Express, or All About My Mother by Almodovar. Because in those films, you have an agent whose ability in the world is constrained by a situation. But through a series of feedback loops which provide them a point of view outside of themselves, they develop agency in time. And it's not a big T, it's actually almost like an exfoliation or a splintering of times into a sheath, a bundle, to steal that term from Michel Serres, of times, some of which have agency in the immediate present, some of which are reversible, and some of which have agency distributed across a wide range of possible pasts, futures, and presents. And so this question of agency in relationship to energy for me is crucial.
I think the term agency could be a good transition to the poem by Danielle.
Yes.
Right?
No, I mean, this is such a beautiful book, Jonas, and it's so appropriate to come to designers and academics at this point in time where we find ourselves adrift in a way. And I think this conversation of agency is also really pertinent at this moment in time, that we, as you laid out, oscillate between the fear and the naive. Closer?
Yeah, perfect.
Naive anticipation. But rooting, taking AI and removing it from just its agency as being a tool, I think is really interesting, right? Like it's not the mute tool that we use as architects. It's something much bigger and much vast, and to ground it in material and also in feedback, I think is a really beautiful thing. It is rooted in material, as these things don't. The digital project doesn't exist without materials. So I think to root it and give the conversation of agency in relationship to that, and give AI a material and take it outside of just a passive tool, I think is really interesting as a proposal within the book. I myself, I think it becomes really interesting when you start to engage with this in your process, to understand materials being integral but also having its own intelligence, which is super interesting. But that we work within this feedback, and I think that's when we have this exchange. That's when we intermesh ourselves with these kind of amazing next level intelligence. And that's what's beautiful about this book, Jonas.
Thank you, Danielle. Every word you said I agree with, and same true of these guys though. The problem is, if these start to talk and they lift off, I can only look from below and wonder what's happening in that sphere. And my suspicion is that it is similar for many in the room. So I propose this. We stop with this reading stuff and discussing stuff. We do one more bit that is textually more atmospheric, and if you'd be up for that, I would love for you to sonically accompany my reading. Not necessarily at the same time. I know you're resisting that. You're thinking that would be too much of a, jam session a la, I don't know, Lennon McCartney or something like that. No, but I can read it, and then if you could respond sonically and then we move into Q&A. We had another bit and a third bit, but I realized that I took too much time with the acknowledgements, and there's a certain limit to our attention, all of ours. So I think it would be cool if you just, if I read that little, which is almost like a poem, and then, would you be okay with that, Ed?
Why don't we throw it to me? I suggest we do a Q&A, but if we stop for me to do something live, it won't work very well. I'll do something when everyone's talking in the background afterwards. That way nobody has to focus.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I have to do that from here because the cable is too short. I would love to talk about each and every slide of this for half an hour with you. And maybe this is just the opportunity for us to promise to meet again somewhere in some form in constellation. I'm trying to find that piece, and the piece is called Cobalt Passage, and it relates, I think, very deeply with what Danielle said and what Ezio and supported, and what Ed and Gökhan were just addressing in a different sphere. I have to just find it. Oh, here we go. So the anecdote from the perspective of an atom. Imagine, if you will, a cobalt embedded with the earth mineral currents, shifting with pressures and heat, transforming through deep geological time. And now I do this critical anthropomorphic view, suspending analytical critique for 1 second, and inhabiting, like here, an orange font, this one. Billions of years ago, I was forged in the explosion of a dying star, eventually finding myself into Earth-forming crust. In planetary cycles, I drifted through slow, continuous exchanges, settling into minerals, dissolving, reforming, then a rupture. Vibrations pulsed through the rock, and the molecular arrangements that structured my existence are forced apart. Torn from the ground, I enter a different trajectory, one of acceleration, separation, and directed transformation. As the mineral I have helped form is smelted and purified, I am processed into a crucial component of a lithium-ion battery, destined to become part of the energy infrastructure in an AI data center. No longer part of the slow passage of geological time, I am folded into the circuits of industrial production. Now, I facilitate energy flow, releasing and storing charge in continuous cycles. The systems I sustain demand constant input of electricity drawn from the grid, resources pulled from across the planet. The currents I now conduct extend outwards, binding me into an expanding network of perpetual extraction and consumption. And now we're back to human, and I skip the gray and just say, from the depth of the earth to high-tech data centers, the journey of this atom traces a shared materiality where all entities, human or non-human, are entangled in the fabric of reality.
The soundscape you're hearing was done before the event started this afternoon. Danielle was here while it was desperately being put into position because, it didn't seem like it was actually going to come together. But there was one comment I wanted to make about the soundscape. I was looking at the question of the language of the birds, and I was going back through a little bit of the Edda, and the idea that there's this very beautiful carving in Sweden which depicts how Sigurd learnt the language of the birds. Yes? And I just want to give you this one image in words here. Sigurd, I'm just reading from the Wikipedia entry, so forgive me. Sigurd is sitting naked in front of the fire, preparing the heart of the dragon for his foster father, Regin. Sigurd touches the heart before it has finished cooking, burns his finger and puts it in his mouth to ease the pain. No sooner has he tasted the dragon's blood than he starts to understand the language of birds. And so, this came to me a week ago, maybe 5 days ago, whenever we were texting and thinking about doing some kind of soundscape. I think it would be a wonderful project going forward to orient something which is a much, much larger soundscape around what you're working on in the book. But the idea that, of course, the allegory of the heart of the dragon and the flame that's cooking it and the blood, which allows us to understand everything, I think, is one of the key questions that we're facing right now and that you're taking on with the book. It's the question of materiality and what kind of catalyst can jump across multiple systems and multiple scales to catalyze something, whether it's the ability to speak with the language of the birds, which of course is very mystical and plugs us into all sorts of systems, or if it's the ability just to speak with the LLMs that are emerging that are intensely materially rooted. To me, that was the image that was, kind of floating in front of me the whole time after we discussed this a few days ago.
Shall we open it to
Yes.
Q&A?
Yes.
Does anybody have a question?
Yes.
You want to come closer? Just come over here. There's plenty of room.
I just want to talk about, you said the binary between hardware and software, and your argument for the existence of a material intelligence not wholly dependent on us as a singular human above everything else material. I'm wondering, in these algorithmic machines and AI, it's based on hardware that comes from abstracted logical chains that we invented and only exist within our abstracted philosophy and theory and ways of thinking that doesn't exist in nature for the most part. And I'm wondering if in your book you kind of address this, like for example, a circuit board and how it's designed is based on a logical network to get to derive information, understand information, and the algorithms itself in the AI in the software sense is also dependent on something similar. But if we look in nature, we don't really see these kind of logic. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's a great question. I don't know if I can. Hello? Thank you so much for the question. These are Pratt students, they're not messing around. They're getting right to the bottom of it. What you're describing is actually the classical model of computation, the algorithmic model, right? And for that, you're absolutely right. That is, the distinction of that is absolutely necessary, because that's how they operate, right? They're directed, rule-based systems. And the whole, from an architecture perspective, the whole parametric paradigm has been completely based on that. What we're discussing here is a different kind of computation, in fact. Both in terms of the technological base that I was trying to discuss, not just with the quantum bit that fluctuates, which is the next frontier, if you want to call it that, of the machines, but also the way that the AI models themselves operate and depend on actual entropy at the bottom of it all. And so you understand the difference between these, let's say from your perspective, dabbling, as I know, in rhino grasshopper, days and nights and long nights, and then, coming up with these beautiful things. You are, and the word parameter is crucial, right? You're defining parameters within which you're opening a search space of possible designs. Though that corridor that you're describing is finite, right? The difference between those classical, I want to call them algorithmic models, and the AI models that we're discussing here. I mean, AI is this very, very broad term. Gökhan, who just arrived, thank you, sir, pointed it out years ago when he was interviewed about a studio that I ran, and he was a student at for the Biennale in Korea, and he was interviewed. He said, AI is the term that's way too broad. That doesn't really mean anything. And I try to define it. In fact, there's in the back of the book, there's what I call an AI index, gives it a attempt of an open structure of taxonomy. But to cycle back to your question, the difference between the classical algorithmic models, including the parametric, Rhino, Grasshopper stuff, and the models that we're talking about is that the probe space, to use another Deleuzian term, is not finite. Meaning the latent space is not a space that has boundaries in and of itself. So what the AI model does, including the currently, I want to say most powerful, at least in the visual arts, the diffusion models, is that they identify a pattern basically. And the way that diffusion models do that, I can get into, it's really quite fun because we did in studio material, let's say brother to that, or perhaps grandfather to that, which is actual ink diffusion. I'm getting a little bit off a tangent, but I tried to answer your question, which is basically what you're talking about is the models that we currently have in our studios as kind of the lineage of CAD, computer-aided design, right? We define what it's got to do, and it gives us versions of that. And that's really important, very powerful, you know. Patrick Schumacher apparently loves it, right? Now, what we're talking about, though, is that, for instance, the diffusion models, they look at a, let's say, meaning or structure in the form, for instance, of an image or so, right? And they diffuse it towards entropy, towards chaos, right? No more meaning, no more structure. And what the model does, it maps that process from structure to chaos, and then reverse that. So it's called reverse diffusion, right? Now, once the structure of the pattern is established, it doesn't mean that when it is reapplied that it is in any way interested to conforming to a designer-defined corridor, right? It could go anywhere, right? Long as it is part of that pattern system, right? So I think that this is one part of the sort of the interest from a design perspective, that if you truly want to engage with those, and I'm not talking about image AI per se, but the general idea of these models, we can not any longer insist on the full control of the outcome at any meaningful level. Now, we can talk a lot about the ethical consequences of current AI models in that domain, the diffusion models as they come to us first as image engines, but there's a chapter in the book that looks at other stuff too, that's actually, in my mind, more important for architecture, that has to do with geometry, morphology, structure, and space, right? Which is not a critique of the image AI models. They have given us a really super interesting discourse. We've got a bunch of people here from Penn and from Pratt, and they've been part of the, I want to say, the aesthetics discourse that we've had over the last decade or so with the advent of image AI. And that's great and that's valuable, and for the philosophers among us, this is really important stuff. But really, architecture cannot just be limited to that, right? So what I was trying to explore is how these same diffusion models, meaning the same, quote, architecture of an AI model, is currently developed beyond images. It is beyond even design, of course. There's all kinds of disciplines of industry, from medical to automotive, and unfortunately, very, very sinister industries that all tap into this, right? But even in architecture, there are disciplinary or industry-specific diffusion models that we're discussing here, right? And if you go that way, it won't be anymore that you define the parameters. And ultimately, I think it answers the part of your question as well that relates to your very, I think, beautiful critical mind. And I know that from studio, and I deeply appreciate it. I really do, you know? It may not always seem like that at the moment at a desk script because I have an agenda. I want to tell you something, right? But I go out of that room and I say, dude, yeah, keep that, please. And you have that, and that's it's very important, and you should always keep that. But just to conclude, what you're criticizing, or maybe not criticizing, what you're asking about is, can we truly overcome the software-hardware divide if it is that human that sets up a symbolic or algorithmic logic that is then executed by a material engine? And I would argue that's not any longer the case with these. That was the case with our parametric and algorithmic engines. It's not the case with AI models moving forward, because they do fundamentally depend on material to actually truly deliver the promise. Because actual randomness, actual entropy cannot be symbolically or algorithmically derived. It can only come from matter. And this is not some, obscure philosophical or whatever conceptual idea. This is actually reality. The new models, the new AI models that are being developed or are in R&D, they have at the bottom of it material that provides that fundamental entropy. And just to turn back to the book a little bit, I'm sure I didn't answer your question, but to turn back to the argument of the book, also something that has been evolved through a conversation with Gökhan very deeply. Interestingly, I came from what is sometimes referred to as new materialisms, all of those guys like Karen Barad and Jane Bennett and and our friend Manuel in some sense, right? Manuel de Landa, one could argue is, Sanford is very, very skeptical about all of these labels, especially if they were applied to him. You should read the very first page of the book and the very first footnote, and you know what I mean. But Gökhan was critical about my distinction between the classical atomists and materialists and contemporary new materialists. And an example of that is the lineage of Democritus to Lucretius. Those guys are referred to by many of the contemporary new materialists. And what Lucretius said, and that's crucial, and he got that from Epicurus. So if Democritus was the first one to actually develop the atomist model for real, it was then Lucretius who emphasized the agency of the particle itself. So the idea, the original Democritus idea, that elements just fall and rain from the sky in parallel lines, right? And they depend on us. We're coming back to the parametric engine where you define the parameters. They depend on us to touch them, to, in a ripple effect, create structure, chaos, leading to structure, as Ceres would say. Lucretius says, no, it doesn't need us. It has it in itself already. Yeah? It doesn't need us. There is what he calls the swerve, or the clinamen, that's eternal to material. Where material from the inside moves outside, right? Gökhan was talking about Simondon earlier briefly, who made that point very clearly when he said the classic holomorphic model, that stuff is inert, nearly dead, right? And we have to form it, and that's the only way that we can, I would say for us here, design. Simondon wasn't that interested in the design of it, he was more interested in the technical object and its agency. But the idea that matter has to be formed from the outside is completely left behind if you consider what Lucretius said, right? It is from within. The material has an agency from the start.
Get more questions. Very good. More questions, please.
Thank you. I think I'm more interested overall. I think we're gonna have the experience of all these great minds together in one space, and I'm a bit concerned. And going back to the notion of the way that we're talking about AI, it's not that I don't think it's not necessarily as a form of a tool or a way of looking at this form of like understanding a form of architecture through another language, I guess I'm brought back to a conversation that Delanda and Graham had at Pratt about this approach. At the end of the day, it is skipped through or it's brought out through us as an answer. We are the answer, right? We decide what image goes on this page. We decide what system, no matter how you try to approach it, how to represent it at the end of the day. The outcome is very much driven by our decision, even if it's produced by this software, right? Which copies or maybe experiments on that approach. And I guess I'm concerned in the sense of looking at it as something that will have the answer, and almost like we're washing our hands of that approach or that part, when in reality I feel like it's very much ironically on its name that it's artificial, right? Intelligence, in the sense of fake. It's a mimicry. It's not really necessarily understanding into that scope. That it brings me back to, you were bringing movies as reference, and I'm thinking of Ex Machina, for example, in that particular analogy when they say Pollock, you know, his painting, if he were to have even stop for a second and think about what step to do when dropping the drop of painting, he wouldn't drop a single drop, right, of paint in the canvas. So I feel like that's at the end, at the core of this conversation. Do we really have, the machine really does have that proper agency, when at the end of the day, if we were to compare these two examples, AI, much like Pollock in that moment, it needs, in our case, our thinking to do the action, right? Well, versus like Pollock, for example, if we would have waited or thought about it, he wouldn't have done it. The same way I feel like with AI or these artificial machines, without somebody to tell them, yes, no, stop here, produce this, there's no like proper outcome at the end of the day. So I feel like, I guess I'm opening it to that conversation.
Thank you so much. I want to, in a moment, ask Danielle, Ed and Gökhan to answer your main question, but I would like to respond quickly to something you said at the beginning when you were referring to Harm and Delanda in their conversation, which is not really in the book. There's a side note that references the text when they're talking about. The book is called The Return of the Real, I think. No. Okay. Anyway, so they have a conversation, right, that oscillates between, you know, obviously triple O, because it's, you know, him, and maybe a little bit Delanda's material world, and they agree on realism, right? The main platform where they meet is realism. And I want to say this here because I didn't have the opportunity to write this. I wrote it, but it was among the pages that we cut, and I think it's good that way. But I think because you're mentioning those two guys, I want to guys say there's something I find a little problematic in that discourse, which is they discussing Karen Barat, and I should sort of preface this by saying that I love Manuel Delanda, like in the truest sense of that word. I'm a student of his. I constantly think through his work. It just happens to be so. At the same time, I am deeply critical of the discussion those guys had, because I happen to have read Karen Barat's work very deeply, and they, I'm not a feminist, obviously. I don't know nothing about it in academic terms, also don't have a right gender and all that. But that conversation I found quite problematic, where they're accusing her of basically being an anti-realist. Yeah? And they do this on the basis, and that's Gran Harmon mostly, by saying that she puts the human perception in front of any reality, which truly would be anti-realism, but that's not at all what she does. instead what she does, take a quantum approach, where she says generally the measuring, right, has an impact, you know. If you have the collapse of the quantum field, it's called, that happens at the moment of the observing. But that's not the same as talking about the human consciousness at all. Anyway, I want to hand it over to the main part of your question. Danielle, you want to start?
I love the ex machina reference. And of course, she gets out in the end, right? Closer? Okay. She gets out in the end. She runs. But I think it's very apropos at this point. Like, we're beyond talking about authorship. No one wants to talk about authorship. Now we talk about agency, right? Because it's how much are we willing to give up? How much? What is that exchange, right? And I think that's what's so interesting about Jonas's book, right? It goes right into the agency conversation because it's, when we get into agental coding, we're not part of the workflow anymore. As architects, we've been toiling with the workflow, this software, that software, to get the thing that we have in our minds, right? And now that's taken away, in a way, really. So I think that's super appropriate to talk about that, to be concerned about that, and to make a decision as a designer. What percentage, are you willing to give up, or are you willing to entangle yourself within this? But it's definitely, it's changed what we do as designers forever. I think that's what when I say we're adrift, I feel like that's the context that we find ourselves in. So I think your question is very appropriate, and I think it is a conversation about agency.
Yeah, let's get more questions.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more, and then we have time to ask some questions to each other, have another drink, and get the book.
Hello. I think, so I worked in this space before it was called AI, it was more so like machine learning. And something I'm noticing that's underpinning some of the conversations happening right now is looking at these generative AI tools as an other. And I think part of that's just because they've been delivered to us that way. So when you look at the OpenAI ChatGPT moment, it's a startup company that then releases a product that you go into a chat box with, and then maybe you have some of the generative image models too that kind of come that same way. But I'm curious I'm curious about how y'all may be introducing to your studio practice, not just these third-party services that exist on somebody else's computer, but now a lot of these tools can exist on your laptop, your MacBook, which creates a different type of dynamic. It's not just this other that goes out and does some magic that's powered by some very smart people in Silicon Valley. Some of it could be directly ran on your computer with your information, with a lot more of your direction. So one of the big bottlenecks for these third-party services is the information that they have access to. So they train everything on the internet, all the pictures that the public could get. And so now when we go towards the future, we're looking towards trying to get this long tail information that's a little bit harder to digitize or to represent, or to even give somebody the right incentives to share it. So if you were to get if you were able to download your brain to the OpenAI team, you'd probably be out of a job. And so at a certain point, you have to make that decision, like, do I want a job, or do I want this like very wonderful company to continue to exist? And so I'm curious, as that is something that is not necessarily being said in this conversation, but seems to be around this conversation, is that there is not just this third-party service, there's opportunity to do local computation, local generative AI, even local curation of data that powers these systems. How is that being introduced to the studio and directly to your practices?
Thank you, that's a wonderful question. In fact, that is the missing part that we haven't talked about yet, which I find in your question there are a couple of things. One has to do with the distinction between cloud-based AI systems and the possibility of us taking charge and having individual bottom-up systems. So we're not anymore at the mercy of large corporations or, God forbid, authoritarian regimes, which is perhaps the most pressing issue of our time right now, in this country anyway. The other part has to do with perhaps the ethics of AI. And there's a part of the book where we're laying out several parts. One that you mentioned is basically the fear of losing a job. And that fear is very, very real. It's not just a fear anymore, it's that what we're facing. And I just like to believe, I've almost convinced myself of it, that the question of AI taking our jobs away is not so much a question about AI, but about how our economic system and our corporations operate and are structured. With this enormous greed of a very small population extracting the rest of us, it's no surprise that these are the consequences of these AI models if they are in their hands. So that is what I am deeply thankful for in your question, because it's something that is way too little discussed. I want to say not just generally in AI, but also particularly in architectural discourse. I think we as architects, and I'm guilty of it as everybody else, we shy away from naming these things because we are fundamentally, structurally dependent on them. I'll give you an example of this. A year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, there was a little rally on the Pratt campus, the main campus in Brooklyn. And that had to do with one of the main atrocities abroad. And I went over there, and there were a bunch of students and a bunch of faculty. And this one faculty member, I think he was from the arts department at Pratt, turned over and said, "I haven't seen you here." I said, what school are you from? I said, "Architecture." And he kind of like, almost like in a pitiful way said, "Yeah, you're the only one here. Yeah, you're architects, you know. You depend on the clients and the commissions. You can't afford to be here." In the end, I think that speaks to your question, right? And I think it's time that we discuss this more openly. I think there was a certain apolitical attitude in architecture, I want to say, like almost my entire career, or whatever, lifetime even. But it's not always been that way. Architecture has defined itself not only through that kind of production, but also has always had a very fundamental socio-political ambition. And I would love it if AI just sparks us to rethink these things. You know, whether we blame it unfairly or not for job losses or atrocities, all of these things in my mind are not an AI problem. They're also not necessarily a human problem, but they're a structural problem of the political and power systems that we are deeply involved in, especially as architects.
Can I say one thing very quickly? To bridge between the point that you raised and the previous person's point. So I think in the past 6 to 12 months, edge computing systems, where you can, yes, generate images locally on your machine if you have, I don't know, 48, 96 gigs of RAM. You know, not cheap, but you know, not nation state level. They've transitioned to being systems where you can run nearly state of the art locally if you invest maybe $40,000 to $50,000, which is more than I probably can afford to invest. But plenty of people in this room can probably drop 50 grand if they wanted to have close to a state of the art AI system that's running offline, developing bioweapons, or engineering new materials, or doing whatever else they want to do offline that they don't want Claude or OpenAI or Google to know about. That is the scariest thing to me that I can think of. And simultaneously, it's the most empowering, because if you're a good actor, then you may suddenly have the ability to do something truly extraordinary. I want to link this to the point that this gentleman made. The question of agency for me Bernard Vinge, the science fiction writer, once said that life is basically nested subroutines. That's not a huge visionary statement to make, but it's a good one, it's clear. There are a lot of nested subroutines, billions and billions of them. But any complex system is nested subroutines. The only link that I would make here is to say, can we use those kinds of quasi-biological models or low entropy systems models, not only to model a planetary computational network, but also to model the way that you and I think. Instead of looking at it's the de-anthropocentrizing that we talked about at the beginning. There is very, very little special in the way that we think if you compare the way that we think to photosynthesis in a leaf. In fact, aliens arriving here might be much more interested in a leaf than they would be in human culture or jazz or mathematics. Yeah. And so I think the question of where agency is, without losing whatever the most vulnerable and beautiful and precious things that we have as humans are, the question of where agency and where identity lie is really something we have to critically question. Yeah. So I don't think that creativity is the domain only of humans. We are just a temporary exploration of a phase space of intelligence. And there are lots of other ones all around us on this planet. So understanding that then I think would give us maybe a conceptual toolkit to come back to what you raised and even link it to what you raised in terms of a network of agencies.
Thank you. I don't know what I'm doing here really, but Jonas forced the microphone into my hand a few minutes ago. I said, absolutely not, take it away from me. The reason is because my head was going to explode. So all I want to say, though, is that Jonas has opened with a rigor that we don't have yet in the field, and with a sincerity, an exploration, and an investment of energy in a topic that we all need to know a lot more about before we talk about it like this. And I just hope that that's what it is. It starts the game, it starts the ball rolling with serious people, and not people who are reporting on things they saw on Instagram yesterday or social media.
I think that's a great place to end, because every time I try to figure out AI, my head is going to explode. So, thank you so much for meeting us again. But I do want to say that, you know, we as booksellers, you know, Alvar and I are not architects, but we have found our way into understanding architecture through books. And they're not digital, and they're not something that is the, you know, AI, but they are really physical and tangible, and they bring us together, and they help us understand the world through the authors and the people that come together to talk about them, and that's what we did here tonight. We might not understand everything, but we did try, and the book will help you understand more. So if you'd like the book, meet us there at the book bar. They're $49.95, hot off the press. Please keep in touch. We have some time to mingle and ask questions, and Jonas is going to sign books as well.
Yes.
So please do that. At Head High, you know, we have amazing things coming up. We're doing a record release on Thursday. We have our lamp show, which is our biggest event of the year. It's an open call. We get hundreds of submissions from all over the world, including many architects. This year it's going to be at the Boom Boom Room at the Standard. It's on May 8th, so please join us for that and check out the designs. And I'll leave it at that, but I do want to say thank you to Pratt and thank you to Stephen for bringing us here tonight. And one last thing, if you're in a white stool, they stack, so just get them out of the way so we can all hang out. Thank you.
For all the hard work. Let me just